member of ILA, and I'll be handing over to a different host in a moment, but I'll first just set the scene for today. ILA, as you know, is the Luxembourg Institute of Directors. It aims to promote best practices in corporate governance in Luxembourg and abroad. In the context of COVID-19 crisis, ILA launched this initiative to help boards identify key topics to be thinking about. Today we're joined by quite a large array of experts who will be introduced to you in a moment, all of them very active within governance matters and within ILA. So just before handing over, a few house notes. This webinar takes the format of a discussion with our panelists on various topical issues. Viewers can post questions in the chat function. We'll try and answer these to the extent possible, but we think we'll leave those to the end of the chat. The session is being recorded and it will be made available openly online afterwards. So please be aware of that if you stay online. And please remember to stay on mute throughout the entirety of the session. So let's get started. Today, we're looking at topics related to managing current challenges in illiquid funds. Michael Hornsby will be leading you through this. Mike is known to many of you. He's a recently retired partner who had been leading EY's real estate funds practice and is currently a member of INREV's management board and a member of ILA's Alternatives Funds Taskforce. So Mike, on that note, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Monique. As Monique said, today we're going to focus on illiquid funds, liquid alternative funds. So we have representatives from the industry today, from private equity, from real estate, from venture capital. We have accountants representing big four firms, and also from the legal perspective as well. So I'll just briefly introduce our panelists. So we have Hans-Juergen Schmitz, who's managing partner of Mangrove Capital Partners. We have Peter Veldman, head of fund management, EQT Fund Management. Hello, Peter. We have Keith Burman, independent director and real estate experts. We have Robert White, who's a partner leading our real estate practice for EY in Luxembourg. We have Andrea Montresori, a partner from PwC. And we have Gilles Dusemon, partner at Arendt and Medernach. So I think, thank you to all our panelists for joining us this morning. And I think we have a good cross-section of the industry represented there. So today, we're going to have a high-level discussion, really focusing on some of the board challenges facing alternative funds, liquid alternative funds, as a result of COVID. So we're going to focus on some of the difficult key judgments and estimates that fund management teams and boards need to be involved with, some of the key decision points, and also communications with investors. So the kind of chat is organized into three sections, items, elements related to going concern considerations for both closed-ended and open-ended funds. Also, we're going to focus on liquidity considerations in the context of some open-ended funds out there, and also how that sort of transfers into communications with investors, transparency on key decisions, disclosures of key information, and then hopefully we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any questions and answers. So first of all, I'd like to sort of get Keith and Gilles active in the first chat, just to sort of set the scene about board responsibilities in general and how that has changed in the current environment. So Keith and Gilles, how has board responsibilities, your role as a board member, changed in the past weeks and months? What are the new dynamics of how meetings operate and discussions happen at a practical level?
I'll go first, Mike. I think what I saw in the first quarter was obviously people dealing with the idea of fully virtual meetings and figuring out what that meant and whether they had sufficient capacity or legal authority to do that. Obviously, the change in emergency regulations helped in that scenario. move very quickly on to COVID-19 and what did it mean. And back in March, we didn't really know, but we were starting to get into the reporting cycle for some of the funds in April. We're certainly meeting and discussing practical impacts to current portfolios. And again, we didn't really know what was going to come. And so we were starting to flesh out a plan. And then as you got through into April, May, June, then the discussion that we'll come to later, going concern and so on, became very relevant, because when you got presented with a set of accounts, having to give representations on going concern became a very, very, very focused discussion, because it was a much more real concept this year, a much more difficult concept. Gilles?
I think thank you, Keith. I think there was a renewed focus on board responsibilities and also the liabilities that come with it. It's really been a question about what must we do, what should we do, what could we do in the wake of an developing crisis, and this went crescendo. But when we consider that this crisis happened at a time when we were, for many companies and funds, in the midst of, let's say, the annual accounts preparation and approval process, all of that got interrupted. And that kind of interrupted, or there was some serious interference. And so that raised, then suddenly, there was suddenly a number of new topics suddenly being put to the board. Those topics pertaining to, what about my relationships with the counterparties? Do I need to move closer and interact more intensively with the various counterparties, be they portfolio managers, investment advisors, depositories, administrators, auditors, etc. And there were a number of topics, be it valuations, be it reporting, be it liquidity management, etc., that kind of popped up, and not in the usual way. And so that got, of course, the attention of many board members in an entirely new manner. And so it was then a question of really doing a mapping exercise of the issues out there, and not only looking statically at the moment, but also looking forward. And so we saw a number of boards that were clearly not considering this to be over within a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but who were looking at the long-term effects and thinking 6 months, 12 months, 18 months ahead, pushing out on another. I mean, there were those who were in the, let's say, annual approval process, but then there were also, that's one side of the coin, and the other side is really the ongoing business. So investments, liquidity management from facility, bank facilities point of view. Would there be covenant breaches? Would there be liquidity needs that are not yet or have not been anticipated in the business plans? And so we've seen a multiplication of issues, questions, and each time putting it into the legal and regulatory framework, meaning, do I have specific legal obligations that are impacted by this? Can I still fulfill my legal obligations? Keith mentioned that the Lux government was quick to provide a COVID framework, legal framework, which would give us more time, and which we're still using today, and which we will be using up to almost the end of the year if it isn't extended. And then there were some other COVID-related measures, let's say, also from a tax point of view, because before COVID, board meetings would not happen like our chat today, but board meetings today happen via this chat. And for all of those of you who sit on these boards, the intensity has gone up significantly. And with the intensity going up, the questions go up, the challenges go up. So, and we see now that people are kind of settling into this new reality, that there is more forward planning and mapping out of the issues yet to come.
Thank you, Gilles and Keith. That was a good introduction. So I think let's now sort of dive into some of these elements that you just mentioned there. So first of all, let's just examine, one of the fundamentals of that underpins all these different decisions and assessments, which is cash flow. So the question here is, do funds have sufficient cash flow to be able to continue as a going concern? What are the, and I guess there's all kinds of other analysis that we'll look at later that stem from having as good a cash flow prediction over a period of time as you can possibly have. So I'd like to introduce Andrea and Peter in this chat. So Andrea, Peter, obviously we're in very uncertain times, every single fund is unique. It has different sort of dynamics, real estate, private equity, venture capital, etc. But still, I assume that, having a good, robust forecasting, budgeting process, which is adapted to the current environment, is an essential component of any going concern assessment. Could you just comment on that and describe how that has evolved in your experience?
Yeah, if you want, I can start, Peter, if you want. As Keith was mentioned before, it's true that there was an evolution from March until now. The board of directors has a big burden because they have to monitor the quality of the information and at the same time to exercise the judgment to assess the going concern and the evolution of the fund. But if you think in March, nobody knew where the crisis was going, nobody had the crystal ball, and now at least we know that management are starting to at least create different scenarios that the board can use to assess. Business plan and cash flow usually are made on key variables that the board has to develop together with management. We talk about, when we think about buyout or PE, we talk about a lot of the effect, where very potentially there is a redundant of the demand and the offer, or L effect, where there is potentially stagnation. The key point for the BP business plan and cash flow is to be really tight and close to management, analyze what are the key variables that should be revised, and of course try to assess and to also to be, I would say, consistent with the reality. So an exercise that we see a lot is budget against forecast, every, I would say, regular pit stop that board has to do with management.
So typically, what sort of time horizons are we talking about here? I mean, I guess there's a sort of long-term planning horizon, 3 or even 5 years, but then there's a much shorter term horizon. So, I mean, typically, what sort of time horizons do you see for these more detailed, more forensic cash flow forecasts, which are kept up to date on a regular basis? Is that 1 year, 2 years, 18 months?
No, sorry, Andrea. If I look from our funds, it's even shorter. And I think that the big risk that you have is because you have multiple investments, that some of the investments will come with a cash flow prediction sooner, and then they'll be like the first to draw cash from the funds. Whereas from the fund perspective, you need to look at the portfolio of companies and make sure that you have a proper allocation process. So I think the aim is to really align that process of how the cash flow is up to date, and you have a similar time frame. So we have a really short term, really next 3 months, next 6 months, and then a slightly longer prediction. So that's one part. And then I think you also want to make sure that you have a framework that you can apply across the different deal teams that advise you on that. And I think the other part for the board members on the call to realize is that most of the times you see that the business is quite optimistic, so they underestimate the impact that such a crisis will have, and they overestimate the speed of recovery. So I think that's also something to really challenge from a cash flow prediction. And this is something that we have done. We have been preparing ourselves for a storm. Did we expect COVID to happen? No, of course not. I don't think that was on anyone's radar, but I think that's why you have these models and why you test them from time to time. In good times, it's easy. It takes 5 minutes to discuss them in the board, but you make sure that the models are there.
So Peter, it must be a real challenge I mean, we're obviously living in very uncertain times. Things are changing week by week, month by month. There must be a real practical challenge just to reset these forecasts and repeg them to reality on a regular basis. Is that an operational challenge you see?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that's an effort from the entire firm the managers, the portfolio managers, all the way to the deal teams, to the portfolio companies themselves. And there's a lot of pressure on specifically the financial teams there to make sure that they have updated forecasts almost on a bi-weekly basis, and that these are really tested as well.
Yeah. So presumably you also look into various scenarios. I can imagine certainly a lot of my clients, would work with a base case, a realistic base case, and then, a worst case scenario, a best case scenario, and start playing around with different optionality within these cash flow forecasts. Is that something either of you see?
Yeah, no, that's definitely what we've seen as well. We've done, basically, we had 3 scenarios that we tested. Let's say a short-term V type of recovery, a longer time W type of recovery, and an even longer, let's call it an L shape if we want to continue to use the alphabet. So we have used these models. So I think currently we're modeling that this is a crisis that's going to have lasting impact until the end of the year for sure. And then of course it's depending on which sectors you are, which regions you are, how deep that's going to hit. If you have real estate in a shopping mall that's closed, or you have food and beverage in Asia, yeah, that's going to be a different than if you have an online model that can actually might actually benefit. Okay,
so clearly this is one of the key building blocks of any going concern assessments made by a fund. Andrea, any closing comments on this piece before we move on?
I think in any case, what Peter was saying is correct, and it's key that the fact it's an exercise, so it's hard to define. It's something that must be revised all the time by management, the board, to be sure to be consistent with the activity of the underlying.
Okay, so let's move on to the next sort of piece, which is part of going concern assessment, which is valuation and valuation uncertainty. So here I'd like to introduce Robert White and Hans-Juergen Schmitz. So obviously we're dealing here with a very broad range of different types of assets, real estate, venture capital, private equity, etc., debt funds, and they all have different sort of characteristics in terms of how assets are valued, the meaning of these valuations, and the use of the valuations. But maybe just to sort of start off with a more kind of general question, what sort of generic challenges are there in the current environment affecting the valuation of any type of asset? Robbie, maybe start with you.
Sure, yes, I'm happy to say a few words on that, maybe from a real estate perspective. I think that, earlier in the session, Keith made quite a useful observation on the learning experience that everyone in this industry has faced from the various issues that have kind of fallen under the COVID umbrella. I think valuation is certainly a primary one of those. I think from a real estate perspective, there's been a couple of primary issues. One being the lack of availability of recent transactional data. Now that is an issue that has affected certain sectors more so than others, but that's certainly one primary issue. I think a second is obviously the ability of appraisers to visit assets in order to actually inspect them. That is a mandated activity for the performance of evaluation. And of course, in this environment, that's not something that has ordinarily been possible. So I think those 2 primary things, and maybe we'll come back to it in a little bit, have obliged valuers to rely an awful lot more on professional judgment and estimates. And of course, the increased reliance on those items brings us to a position where there is potentially material uncertainty in some of these valuations.
So valuations are more theoretical and more model-based and inherently more uncertain. Okay. Hans-Juergen, any observations from VC, private equity? Does that sort of ring true in your industry as well? Hans-Juergen, are you there?
Now I'm muted, sorry. From a venture capital perspective, the picture is slightly different. I'm using a situation, we weren't even at the end of March, and some big private equity houses had come out with statements that would say, well, it'll be a 20% haircut across the board, for example, as an anticipated result to valuations, as an anticipated result of COVID. then we had a very intense conversation with our LPs very early on, just to deflect this, because in venture capital is a 10+ year journey, and your assets, while they may be affected very short term and to a varying degree by COVID, normally in the long run will overcome this. There's other setbacks that assets in venture capital have that are equally as drastic sometimes than maybe COVID. So that's just as a general remark. So we have refrained from rushing into let's say ballpark valuation adjustments to the NAV in the very short term. What we have done is obviously go very deep with individual portfolio companies to assess what is the short, mid, and longer term impact that this could have. And obviously, to give you some examples, anything that is related to healthcare, for example, actually, you could argue should see an uptick in valuation over time. Everything that is related to vacation, travel, hospitality, obviously is the inverse. But only now, probably end of June, beginning of July, we start seeing how businesses come out of this again. And that's the first moment where we now, in looking at Q2 valuations, are actually taking initial actions on valuations. So that's maybe a primary point. Secondary, what's the basis of valuation? The basis of valuation, certainly in venture capital, is not so much comparable transactions, it's really actual transactions affecting your portfolio company. So if you had to raise money during that period because by chance you hadn't been able to close it earlier, then of course you will be affected, and there will be an immediate impact on your valuations, which you can hardly avoid because it's a hard number that's been put on paper by investors for a follow-on investment round. Paradoxically, if you look at multiples as another for let's say scale-ups or growth companies, if you look at market multiples, for example, in software as a service, you could actually argue that it's on the rise. If you look at public market multiples, for example, I mean, you all know and have observed that the public markets are thriving right now, and particularly subscription-based business models have seen multiples that we've never seen before, like in north of 20x revenues, which is very specific, obviously, to venture. So you see a very broad spectrum, which makes it particularly challenging for the fund managers and the boards to come up with a
So a lot of uncertainty. So presumably there's a big difference. I mean, so there's inherent uncertainty in all valuations at the moment, but perhaps the consequences are different in, say, closed-ended funds or VC funds or closed-ended PE funds from, say, open-ended real estate funds. Robbie, perhaps you could comment on that.
Yeah, like I think probably the most practical issue that has been felt in the real estate industry, of course, is the inclusion of material uncertainty clauses in valuation reports. So this is uncertainty clauses
where an external valuer is used, basically.
So an independent appraiser has been mandated to perform a valuation of an asset and has come back with a report which includes a material uncertainty clause. Now, as many of you will know, this clause is something that has been mandated by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. And I think that it has presented a lot of challenges for industry participants to kind of unpackage that topic and decide what its application should be for fund operations, for reporting, etc. I think one thing that's particularly important to note is that it is indeed a disclosure and not a disclaimer. It is not signal that the valuer has been rendered incapable of valuing the asset. It is simply a sign that they are disclosing the fact that they have valued with increased judgment or increased uncertainty. And that kind of goes back to the few initial remarks I made about ability to visit the assets, transparency on transactions in the market, etc. I think so. One of the initial challenges, we first saw these inclusions in March post-COVID. One of the initial challenges that was presented was the sensitivity of this particular clause. I think the initial reports that were issued, they applied this uncertainty clause in a very blanket, a very insensitive fashion to industrial in the same way as they did to living, to established markets in the same way as they did to emerging markets. And of course, that's not immediately helpful. in the sense that those charged with governance need to have transparency on the basis upon which this clause has been included, if they are to then do something about it, vis-a-vis financial reporting or vis-a-vis fund operations. One of the key and most common conversation points we've noted in the industry is the encouragement to have as meaningful dialogue as possible with the valuers to understand the basis upon which this clause has been included, and therefore to put the board in a better position to decide what they may wish to do with it. You asked the question, Mike, open-end funds versus closed-end funds. I think the valuation issue in itself, it impacts both formats. Firstly, if we talk about disclosures. So if we agree that this material uncertainty...
Actually, Robbie, I think we're going to go on to open-ended funds and disclosures in a bit. So basically, from this part of the chat, we can conclude that there is valuation uncertainty across all asset classes, that it has different sort of root causes and certainly different consequences, depending on the type of fund and, and the, whether it's open or closed, and obviously whether there is external or internal valuations, these formal uncertainty clauses, so on and so forth. So let's just hold it there, and we'll take that forward into the next couple of parts of the chats. But before we do that, I'd just like to come back to another kind of building block of going concern assessments, valuation, cash flow we've examined. And I'd like to look at sort of covenant compliance now. And here I'd like to bring back Keith and Peter, if I could. So obviously, a lot of real estate, private equity, VC funds, they tend to be leveraged, some of them to quite a high extent. So, when there's any kind of economic shocks or uncertainties or valuation issues or cash flow issues, it inevitably is going to have a material impact potentially on covenant compliance with external borrowings. So clearly, this is something that can be modelled in the cash flow forecast that we talked about earlier. But could you just sort of, I don't know, either Keith or Peter, maybe just sort of give us a general comment on the implications of debt covenants and going concern assessments and the challenges that you're facing in the current environment and assessing these and managing these?
Yeah, I could definitely kick off there. What I think, and this is always something that happens in the crisis, and it becomes more and more obvious, but I think when you enter into an investment, I think it's super important that you align your confidence with the business plan and the business model. And I think that's why you want to make sure that if you have a more volatile business model, you also have, let's say, averaging out on the confidence, or you might have baked in a confident holiday that you can apply and use. And it's something that you want to have a reporting on, regardless the situation you're in. If you're in nice and sunny weather, just to prepare for when the storm hits. And I think that's what we see as well. Then I think you need to really make sure that you, as a board member, you understand the dynamics of the confidence. Is there an RCF or a second lien that can potentially trigger some confidence on the first lien or senior debt? So I think that's how we try to look at it from a complete picture. And then you're absolutely right, Michael. The cash flow prediction is the start there, because that's what's triggering it. And then of course we're talking about the cash flow predictions. In our case, from the underlying businesses and the potential need. So can we cure?
I suppose there are two sort of, two basic types of covenants. One is cash flow related, an ICR type covenants, and the other one is a valuation type covenants, which would be common in mortgages and real estate, an LTV. So valuation uncertainty obviously has an impact, and the robustness of cash flow is fundamental to both of those assertions. I mean, is there sort of any forward planning here? I mean, if you see that there is potential breaches coming up with some of the scenarios we talked about earlier, is it common that managers will be out there talking with banks on a proactive basis before the event happens to seek sort of some relief from these conditions?
Absolutely, I think that's the part of that forward looking that Peter was talking about, building a scenario, building a future cash flow, and then trying to map how does that drive your KPIs against whatever the covenant is, be it income or valuation based. Because you want to anticipate, you know that it'll take time, and it's better to have time to negotiate with your lender than to have to do it over a weekend. So you want to go to them and say, we can see something coming up in Q3. What can we do about it? Can we defer some of that testing? Can we defer the valuation point until we have more certainty, until we've spoken to our valuers? Can we talk about some kind of a standstill or a waiver or a pushback of some of the testing of the covenant? Of course, when you start talking to your bankers, they probably are going to want to engage with you. They may or may not be willing to help. They probably will have a cost to extract as a result of agreeing to help. But ultimately, they probably don't want to take over the asset themselves. So there is self-interest that they want to find a solution so that you, the expert, the managers, can continue to manage the assets in the best way.
And Keith, I presume this is something that the board, coming back to the sort of top to the board's responsibility here. I mean, it is the board's responsibility to monitor all these different elements and essentially to oversee all these key judgments and estimates around going concern. So being close to covenant compliance and potential breaches and the situation with banks is absolutely within your experience as a board member. It's something that's coming up in your board discussions on a regular basis.
Sure, and obviously in a much more focused way right now over the last 6 months.
Yeah,
it was always there.
Yes.
Something that your risk manager and your AFM should be doing. They shouldn't just be looking at past data. They should be looking forward to give you some kind of a signpost as to what might be coming up. But now it's every time we meet. What's our cash flow? What are our covenants? What has changed since last time we spoke?
And I think one very important point that Keith mentioned already is who's holding the debt. Because if you have a bank, they potentially are more willing to find a solution. If you have a specialized distressed hedge fund, you're up to an uphill battle.
Okay, so let's bring all this together and sort of talk about the going concern assessment overall. Obviously it's pulling together different threads, different bits of evidence, different pillars, as we've just talked about, a few of the key ones. So Robert, Andrea, obviously the current economics condition for a lot of funds is not good for some of the portfolio companies, for some of the real estate, etc. Obviously, it affects different asset classes in different ways. It depends on the nature of the fund. Is it open or closed, etc. The degree of leverage. I mean, could you just give us some general kind of comments on in your experience how management and boards need to work together to assess these various conditions, and what are the key components of the analysis that need to be made at the end of the day?
I think,
Andrea?
I think, it's the going concern, I would say, is the wrap up of the discussion we had before, and you're right. Of course, depend on the life cycle of the investments and the industry. But I think what is key is, as you said before, the valuation of the underlying, the capacity of this underlying to generate yield and distribution to the fund. And of course, I would say everything related to liquidity management. So access to credit, capacity, where is the case to restructuring the debt. And this is, I would say, from investment perspective. On the other side, it's also important when we think about going concern, for example, for a private equity fund, also the investor side, so the top side, where we have to anticipate different scenarios and be a default of our investors or simply a gap between when you call the money and when you get. So I would say valuation liquidity management is the key variables that the board should consider for a going concern basis of the fund. I don't know if, Robert, you think.
Oh, absolutely.
Actually, Robert, I'll bring you in as well, and maybe just ask you to sort of comment from an auditor perspective. So there are, I suppose, different scenarios that you see as an auditor, something which is very comfortable to something which is not comfortable at all. So maybe you could just give us that
Absolutely.
perspective.
Absolutely. I'm happy to give that perspective. And like, I think, you know, broadly, one of the things that I would certainly observe is that this environment has really put a lot of items in the financial statements that have historically been less prominent are now very much front and center. So disclosures around risk and uncertainty, judgments and estimates, they maybe have not received quite as much focus and attention from users and potentially from boards. I think they are now very, very much front and center as a result of everything we've discussed here today. In terms of going concern and the auditor's perspective, what I can say there is the framework itself has not changed, but of course the environment has transformed massively. Now, one of the key items that we always would have observed is that the past has generally been a pretty reliable proxy for the future, with some notable exceptions. We're in an environment now where that is absolutely not the case. Now, going concern from the perspective of the preparer or indeed the auditor stands on two legs. It stands on intention and it stands on ability. Intention should be a relatively quick conversation. And I think in the context of an investment product, it's kind of enshrined in the offering documents themselves. The ability, of course, is more difficult. And I think we've got a couple of facets that we need to look at there. We need to look at the ordinary day-to-day, the ability to turn over suitable amounts of revenues to meet your day-to-day obligations. But we then need to, and I think it was touched on very well earlier by our other panelists, we need to look at underlying conditions that potentially are aggravated by this environment, i.e. dropping valuations, covenant compliance that may be under jeopardy, etc., etc. What we see quite commonly now is stress testing and or reverse stress testing, I would say, you know, establishing what is the ultimate amount of pain that this product can take without breaking, and how are you set in terms of contending with that. So there are a few quick observations, I would say, from a financial reporting and or audit perspective.
Okay, so let's just talk now specifically about open-ended funds. So Keith, Robert, if I could bring you in. So what we learned from the previous sort of chats, obviously valuation uncertainty is not helpful in an open-ended fund because obviously valuations are a key component of the NAV, and if they're uncertain, is it fair to continue to raise money and redeem money with investors, etc.? There's other areas of uncertainty, you know, could be covenant compliance, either actual or imminent issues with covenants, etc. So there can be all kinds of reasons why open-ended funds come under pressure. Could you just sort of give us a helicopter view? I know that both of you have experience with open-ended funds, real estate funds. What are the key considerations that you think about when deciding, and as I'm sure you do, to continue to keep the fund open or indeed temporarily close it or even wind it up? Could you just talk us through the decision-making process there? So I don't know, Keith, Robert, who wants to start?
Keith, please go ahead.
Keith, are you there?
Sorry, I was on mute again. This has been top of mind for the last 6 months, and every NAV point in the big open-ended funds, the board is meeting before the NAV is issued, but it is calculated. But before it's issued, the board is meeting to query everyone from the administrator, the portfolio manager, the valuation committee, to whether this is something we should do, because there are consequences. You know, we will, if we issue a NAV, does that mean we're going to trade on it? Are we issuing it as a marker for investors, but we're not going to trade on it? Are there any trades pending? Because, you know, it's more significant if someone's actually going to move on it or not. Yeah.
And I presume that's both ways, Keith. So you might have a queue of redeemers wanting to get out on the one hand, but you also might have money which has been sitting waiting in the queue for a long time waiting to be drawn down, which is a potential source of liquidity. Sure. But I suppose the question is it fair on either a redeemer or a leaver or a comer to trade on an NAV which is inherently uncertain? So that must be a difficult decision-making process.
It certainly is, and we've had to challenge that every quarter, or that we've had this in the crisis, because we still don't know what's going to come next. We don't know whether our income that hasn't defaulted yet but is deferred, is that part of the picture or not? Should we be doing something about that? It is difficult, but on the other hand, these open-ended funds don't typically have free redemption. So there are other decisions about whether other mechanisms that you have, such as deferral or gating and so on, are those you should bring into play at this point to address this uncertainty as well.
Would you say that sort of, you know, in your experience, sort of typical fund terms that cover those sort of matters that you just mentioned there, you know, temporarily suspending the fund, deferring, gating, are they fairly standard in the industry, or are they typically very specific to each fund product and need to be carefully understood before these decisions are taken?
I think in concept, they're standard, but once you get to a difficult period like this, you start to look very clearly at the exact wording in your particular documents,
right?
Because they may actually vary from product to product within the same stable of managers' funds.
So obviously a key focus for boards over the past few months of open-ended funds. So maybe just focusing now on distribution. So, you know, obviously a lot of funds don't distribute closed-ended funds, for instance. Some closed-ended funds, open-ended funds typically do. So there's lots of different scenarios. You know, distributions can be kind of almost mandatory or even mandatory in the fund documentation, or they can be at the discretion of the board. So maybe Gilles, Peter, just to bring you back in here, what's your experience recently about discussions at a board level about whether to distribute or whether to build cash reserves, you know, as a contingency against the future? Is that something that you've had any conversations about at the board level recently?
I can start. Not really, to be honest. I think one caveat, we're dealing, the majority is closed-end funds, and even the open-end funds, I would say, are semi-open-ended. So typically we don't have those challenges. I think the other part, which is very important to highlight, I don't think we obviously in a crisis, but it's not a liquidity crisis that we've seen in the global financial crisis when the financial system basically closed down. I think it's probably the opposite. So we haven't seen any challenges from a liquidity perspective, and hence haven't had those discussions. But I think in general, we saw some of the, let's say, our peers announcing that they were drawing on all the facilities that they had to make sure that they amassed liquidity in the funds and be prepared a war chest, if you'd like to call it that way. I think we have chosen not to do that, and I think the only thing I would say, if and when you do that's what brings back to the point that Keith mentioned. Then you need to look at your LPA and make sure that you have your lawyers issue an opinion and to cover your from a board perspective, because I think that the biggest risk here is the reputational risk, if any.
Speaking about the lawyer, so
yeah.
Passing over, I mean, we've seen quite a few challenges because, as you mentioned before, there are those funds that have a mandatory distribution clause. So where investors make sure that when you make an exit, when cash is coming up, that this cash is going to investors and is not being recycled. Now, during the crisis, we've seen early on situations where, because of the crisis developing and the planning uncertainty, there are budgeting issues. Let's say you have multiple assets in your portfolio and each asset is to be viewed as a standalone, and now suddenly the business plan, the budget is no longer sufficient to sustain an investment, and there's cash coming in another investment. So now there have been situations where that cash coming in must go out, but where not to default on obligations there are no more undrawn commitments, etc., where then the manager wants to put that cash to work where it is really needed. Sometimes in a situation where, well, there are recallable distributions. So you could anyway go back to investors and say, look, I need that money back to save that other investments. Can I now use this money coming through and allocate it there? The problem is that the documentation very often does not provide for that flexibility. And that's where you touch upon the next topic, which is kind of how do you communicate with investors? How do you engage with investors? Because in many of those situations, the documentation is very clear and the lawyer won't be able to do let's say, the magic by saying, okay, you can do it, but the legal advice will be, you have to engage with your investors and find a solution. Maybe you find an efficient solution whereby the cash can be recycled and there is maybe sufficient flexibility built in, but in many situations also, you do not have that flexibility. You will have to engage with investors. And then there are a number of situations which we've seen as well where, well, there wouldn't be a solution or an answer coming from investors. So you would turn towards finding other liquidity sources to satisfy a problem. But that would then again become a timing issue, because you had, I've seen a number of clients when this crisis started, they immediately turned towards the banks. And they said, because in 6 months' time, they won't listen to us anymore because they will be too busy. So start the discussion as early as possible, secure a lifeline, a credit line for the liquidity issues to come, and then deal with the other issues. Of course, the difficult analysis or discussion then is, again, if you have negotiations with banks, they will want to get hold of the cash flows from other assets, which again, in a number of situations won't be possible. So it's one situation is provoking a series of material situations to be handled in a relatively short period of time. And that brings us then to, okay, how can you tackle it with the investors, or some situations, in some situations that you have to call in, let's say, other solutions, other alternative debt and credit providers and other liquidity providers, be it sidecar funds, top-up funds, annex funds, etc., to save a situation that is developing. Okay, so that brings us on to our sort of final topic. I mean, I want to learn from that on distributions is it's absolutely crucial that, you know, you understand where you are legally before you start to maneuver, and, you know, you analyze your options. But Hans-Juergen, maybe just to bring you into this conversation with Gilles and anybody else who wants to join, you know, first of all, kind of communications with investors in this crisis in general, how do you see that? I mean, is it a very open communication channel with investors? Are you keeping them informed on a regular basis, or is it a more formalistic type communicate? What type of information do you share with them? How far do you go in the interests of the fund, etc.? So Hans-Juergen, maybe just get a comment from you, just to sort of set the scene generally, and then we can build on that.
As a setting the scene comment, if you thought you were very forthcoming in your communication and very regular and very, very transparent, think again, double it up. So that was sort of our mindset to say, okay, we're going into a crisis, and despite the fact that in our case, these are very long-term assets, people are naturally getting very concerned very quickly. So what we have done, for example, as a fund manager and consequently as a board, we have now had very bi-weekly or at least monthly conversations with certainly with our advisory board of the respective funds, and then more broadly a one-to-many communication to our investors outside of the quarterly reporting. And we did go into quite some depth on both the positives and the negatives on an asset-by-asset basis, which granted is maybe not so easy for larger firms. And I'm referring to Peter maybe also how he does it at EQT, which has a large family of different types of investment strategies. But certainly that was our approach, and it was received extremely positively by the investors.
So Hans-Juergen, presumably there is a sort of formal communication, which is in annual reports and quarterly reports and the financial statements and these sort of things. And I think Robert touched on that a bit earlier on, you know, with disclosures and financial statements about risks and, you know, going concern assumptions and situations with banks. And what you're talking about here is more informal, active, engaged, fluid communications with investors about the economic circumstances and realities of what's actually happening.
Asset by asset, because they will, I mean, obviously venture capital is the 90-10 rule or 10-90, right? It's not like every asset will succeed. So they want to really know to what extent, positive or negative, the assets have been affected. And that's how far we went.
Gilles, anything you want to bring in here on communications with investors, disclosures in general, from a legalistic or other perspective?
Really, I mean, you have the regulatory and contractual obligations, and you don't want to miss any of these. But then I'd say there is, it's always a question of who is communicating. For Hans-Juergen and Peter, it's kind of now easy because they are, let's say, sitting on the front line and dashboard and communicating directly. But what if you have delegated your funds board and you have delegated the portfolio management to the portfolio manager sitting in UK and New York? I think reporting to investors is important, but then it's also reporting to the board of the fund from the portfolio manager that is important. So because there needs to be this triangular communication line, open communication line, and there may be situations where the board may wish to participate in this reporting exercise. So it cannot just be handed over to the portfolio manager, but I think the Lux boards would have to ensure that they are somehow involved in the process.
Okay, so just want to pause here. We've got 10 minutes left. Jan, are there any questions that we can bring into the conversation at this point in time, or can we carry on?
We do have a couple of questions. I'd just like to suggest maybe one final word for Robert. I thought maybe he might have something he wanted to say. Robert?
Sure. Sorry, Jan, did you have a question in particular?
No, I thought maybe you just wanted to follow up on the topic of...
Actually, Robert, I have a question for you, just whilst Jan looks at the questions there. So we're talking about communications with investors. So I think, you know, we've talked about closed-ended funds, but obviously I know that you deal with open-ended funds where there are perhaps 80 institutional investors. So it's a,
sure.
It's a different, it's a more public interest type of reporting scenario. Yeah. So how would you build on the comments that have been previously made about communications?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a very, very live topic, and I think that Keith did bring up a point that I always think is particularly relevant. In the current situation with the potential suspension of open-end funds, I think it's important to note that there isn't one size fits all in that regard. So the valuation material uncertainty clause does not necessarily mandate that a fund must be suspended, i.e. the valuation remains the responsibility of the AIFM and the board, and they will of course go through a process in deciding whether or not the fund stays open or not. And that process will be informed by many things, one of which being the composition of the portfolio, i.e. we may have a much longer conversation for something in the hospitality space than we will for the industrial space.
Are investors involved in these conversations at all?
I wouldn't say, from my experience, and Keith will certainly have his view, I wouldn't say that they are involved in that conversation, but I think a very important distinction that can be made is it is quite common that people might look at the post-Brexit suspension of funds in the UK as some form of precedent. Now, I think that's useful, but it's not entirely relevant in the sense that there we were talking about retail investors, yeah, and we were talking about funds that were dealing with liquidity concerns. Here, yeah, we're talking about institutional investors, and we're talking about funds that are dealing with a valuation issue, which is entirely different. Now, I'm not saying that some of those funds don't also have liquidity issues, but what I'm saying is that is not the primary item that's provoking this issue. In terms of transparency, what I would maybe say is what we've seen and what we would certainly encourage is the intention that you don't increase the size of your reporting, but perhaps you take a red pen to the items that are now a little bit redundant, and you sharpen them up with specific content relevant for today.
Okay, so Jan, back to you. Any questions we have from anybody on the chat that we can take at this point in time?
In a way, going back to what Hans-Juergen was saying earlier about, well, COVID-19 isn't the only thing that we have. We have a question from Raffaele Bartoli about the low interest rate environment within the context of COVID-19. I wonder, Raffaele, could you actually explain your question? It seems not. Okay, so Raffaele's question was, how does an enduring very low interest rate environment affect asset valuations, their liability, and the potential consequences, for example, on covenants? Okay,
that's a pretty interesting question, pretty broad question. I think anybody want to take that in 30 seconds? Peter, Robert, Keith, Andrea, anybody there wants to have a go at that?
I can try.
You're a brave man, Keith.
Yes, or stupid. I guess it isn't really the economics of the lending at the moment that's been the driver. It's more the valuation issues and banks' concerns about having to pull back their horns a bit. So I don't think that it's a pricing issue really. That's what I mean. So asset valuation is obviously driven by the availability of finance, but it's not the availability of finance. I think Peter referred to that earlier. You know, there is liquidity available in the markets. It hasn't dried up like it did 10 years ago. So that's not really the issue. It's more around the uncertainty. They're wanting not to be too exposed in case something happens. That's what's driving, I think, the cautiousness and the uncertainty at the moment, and less the certainty that you won't raise money, the certainty that investors are trying to leave. I don't think that's the case. In fact, I've been quite impressed across my open-ended funds how few redemption requests we've received. The intention from the institutional investors seems to be that they need to ride this one out, that they can't do something better with their money elsewhere. And so we've received a few requests, but largely it's been because they felt that they needed to. And when we've told them we have to defer because we have the mechanism in the prospectus, there hasn't been a lot of distress explained by those investors.
Jan, I think we've got time for another question. Yep. Pick a good one.
Two of them. One follow-up from Raffaele. How reliable is a discounted cash flow model when the discount rate is close to zero?
Anybody want to take that?
But yeah, well, I think you try never to look at one model, and you try to use multiple models at the same time to balance that risk. And I think asking the question is answering it. Yeah, it's becoming less predictable, and that's less of a tool.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of the elements of valuation uncertainty we were talking about earlier, is the ability to take an appropriate discount rate in the current environment. Yeah, so certainly in real estate there are different methods of valuing assets, and DCF is just one of them. And you would in each one has different implications in different situations, I think, is my experience. Obviously, if you've got strong comparable transactional data, or new tenants leasing up a building, or this type of thing, then that might, in certain market cycles, be more relevant than a DCF model. Okay, Jan, any last question? Any further question?
Yes, please. Just one final one from Henry Kelly. How long can virtual board meetings continue before Luxembourg substance is seriously questioned by foreign tax authorities? I just wanted to point out that this is really outside of the scope of what we had just considered for today's meeting. Would anybody like to say something about this?
I think Gilles, if you could give a closing comment on that one, please, if you can.
Yes, so you may remember that very early on in the crisis that the OECD, which is kind of, let's say, the supranational tax authority, if you want, kind of released guidance to say, well, as this crisis is going around the world, maybe it's time where people have to stay home, where they have to work from places which are not the usual working places, maybe we need to reconsider and pause the usual routes. And so we are kind of in a moratorium currently still, and to be seen when this will end, because the crisis is still going around, the virus is going around. So, but then again, that is what, let's say, the OECD is saying. And as you know, all or most double tax agreements around the world, and those entered into by Luxembourg, are based on the OECD model. So that's why the OECD guidance is kind of relevant in the relationship between states under DTAs. But I would not be able to say now, will it be the OECD that will have to say, now we go back to normal, or will it be member states saying, like France and Germany and others saying, now we go back to the normal rules? I mean, you may remember that we have special rules in place for cross-border commuters, but which is unrelated to this topic, but it's a similar one. we have to monitor how long the situation may be allowed to go on given the context on the worldwide level.
Gilles, thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to close the chat and thank all you, my panelists. Did a fantastic job there. I know it was a difficult task to get through all these very, very complicated topics. I know in the preparation time, there's a lot of depth to every single thing we talked about there. So congratulations that we managed to get through it at a reasonably high level, and I think convey the meaning of what's at stake here. So thank you to that. And with that, I would hand back to Monique to wrap the meeting up and say any further closing comments. Monique.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, so thanks, Mike, and all the panelists for this timely discussion. I think it was a great insight updating fund boards on all of these topical issues. We will be taking a break for August from the coffee chats, so we'll be back in September. If there are questions or there are topics you would particularly like us to cover, then please send them through. We are already building the plan for the autumn schedule. So thank you again to all our panelists for today, and everybody have a great summer break, and see you after in September. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.